Imagine a general so audacious he defied his own commanders to execute a strike that would shatter the backbone of Nazi Germany's most feared armored divisions. Picture a moment when one man's decision, hidden from history for decades, turned the tide of an entire campaign. Did George Patton's unauthorized night assault on a concealed tank depot change the course of World War II, or has this story been buried beneath layers of classified orders and forgotten dispatches? The answer might rewrite everything we thought we knew about the Battle of the Bulge. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest stretched across Belgium and Luxembourg like a frozen fortress of pine and shadow. For months, Allied intelligence had assured commanders that this sector was quiet, a rest area where green troops could acclimate and battered divisions could recover. The Germans, everyone agreed, were finished. Their armies reeled backwards across the Rhine. Their cities burned under endless bombing. Victory seemed merely a matter of time and paperwork. Then, in the hours before dawn on December 16th, the forest erupted. German artillery tore through the morning fog with a fury not seen since the invasion of France. Entire American regiments vanished under the barrage. Through the smoke and chaos rolled machines that should not have existed, tanks the Allies believed destroyed or depleted. Tiger IIs with guns that could pierce Sherman armor from 2,000 yards. Panthers moving in coordinated waves, their crews fresh and their fuel tanks somehow full. Within 48 hours, a bulge 30 miles deep had been driven into Allied lines, threatening to split the American and British armies entirely. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, panic rippled through the command structure. How had the Germans assembled such a force without detection? Where had these tanks come from? Intelligence reports spoke of skeleton divisions barely holding the line, yet here was evidence of an armored fist powerful enough to reach the Meuse River, perhaps even Antwerp. If the Germans seized the port, the entire Allied supply network would collapse. Months of progress would dissolve into desperate retreat. General Dwight Eisenhower convened his commanders in a schoolhouse near Verdun. The mood was grim. Most officers advocated for a fighting withdrawal, pulling back to defensible positions until reinforcements could arrive. The Germans had momentum. They had surprise. They had tanks that outgunned anything the Americans could field in numbers. Prudence dictated caution. George Patton sat at the table and listened to the defeatism spreading like contagion. His Third Army, stationed to the south, had been driving eastward into the Saar region with relentless aggression. Now his superiors wanted him to halt his offensive, pivot 90 degrees north, and march through winter storms to relieve the encircled town of Bastogne. It was, by any conventional measure, impossible. Entire armies did not simply change direction in the middle of battle. The logistics alone would take weeks. The weather made air support unlikely. The roads were frozen death traps. Patton looked at Eisenhower and said his army would be moving within 72 hours. The room fell silent. Some thought it bravado. Others thought it madness. But Patton had already set wheels in motion that no one in that room understood. He had received intelligence that made him certain of something his colleagues refused to believe. The German offensive was not simply a last desperate gamble. It was fueled by a hidden reserve, a stockpile of armored vehicles that Allied reconnaissance had somehow missed. 3 days earlier, on December 13th, a French resistance cell operating near the town of Clairvaux had transmitted a fragmentary radio message to American intelligence officers attached to Patton's headquarters. The message described unusual rail activity in a narrow valley northwest of Bitburg, deep inside German-held territory. Trains had been arriving nightly for 2 weeks, each one carrying flat cars draped in camouflage netting. Local informants reported the sound of heavy engines idling in the darkness, the metallic clank of tracked vehicles maneuvering into positions. The resistance believed the Germans were assembling a tank reserve, possibly hundreds of vehicles, hidden in a series of natural caves and reinforced tunnels carved into the hillside. Most Allied intelligence officers dismissed the report as exaggeration or misidentification. By late 1944, German industry was shattered. fuel shortages had grounded the Luftwaffe. How could they possibly maintain a secret armored depot of any significance? The consensus was that the French partisans had stumbled upon a repair facility or perhaps a decoy meant to draw Allied bombers away from more critical targets. Patton did not dismiss it. He understood something about the German character that eluded many of his peers. The Germans were methodical. They planned in depth. If they were launching an offensive of this scale, they would have prepared reserves, hidden assets positioned to exploit any breakthrough. The resistance report fit perfectly with what Patton suspected. The Germans were not throwing everything into one desperate lunge. They were holding back a second wave, waiting for the Allies to commit their reserves, and then they would strike again. He called for his intelligence chief, Colonel Oskar Koch, a man whose pessimism had earned him the nickname of the Prophet of Doom. Koch had been warning for weeks that German radio silence indicated preparation, not collapse. Now, with the Ardennes exploding, his warnings seemed prophetic. Patton showed him the resistance report and asked the simple question. If this depot exists, and if we destroy it before the Germans can deploy those tanks, what happens to their offensive? Koch studied the map. The depot, if real, sat roughly 20 miles behind German lines. Reaching it would require a lightning strike through enemy territory, probably at night, with no possibility of reinforcement. The risk was extraordinary. But Koch understood Patton's logic. German armor doctrine relied on reserves. Their officers were trained to hold back strength until the decisive moment. If that reserve could be eliminated before it entered the battle, the entire German plan would unravel. The attacking divisions would run out of fuel, ammunition, and replacements. They would stall. And a stalled offensive in winter was a death sentence. Patton began planning an operation that violated nearly every principle his superiors held sacred. He would detach a battalion-sized task force from his Third Army, send them on a night march deep into German territory, and order them to locate and destroy the suspected tank depot. The mission would receive no air support. No artillery preparation. No follow-up waves. It would be a scalpel strike, swift and silent, relying entirely on surprise and audacity. If the task force succeeded, the German offensive might collapse before it reached the Meuse. If it failed, Patton would lose some of his best troops for nothing, and the blame would fall squarely on his shoulders. He chose Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams to lead the mission. Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion, a unit equipped with Sherman tanks that had fought from Normandy to the German border without breaking. Abrams himself was a legend among armored officers, a man who led from the front and never asked his crews to take risks he would not share. He was also discreet, a quality Patton needed desperately. This operation could not appear in official logs. No written orders could be traced back to Third Army headquarters. If questions arose later, Patton needed deniability. On the evening of December 14th, Abrams met Patton in a farmhouse south of Luxembourg City. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The details of their conversation remain partly obscured by history, as neither man committed the specifics to paper. What is known comes from later interviews with officers who were present in adjacent rooms and from fragmentary notes found in Abrams' personal effects after the war. Patton laid out the mission in blunt terms. Abrams would take a composite force, roughly 300 men, including a company of armored infantry, a platoon of combat engineers, and as many Shermans as could be spared without weakening the line. They would move north under cover of darkness, bypass German strongpoints, and penetrate to the suspected depot location. The objective was simple. Find the tanks. Destroy them. Return before dawn. Speed and stealth were everything. If the force became bogged down in a firefight, it was to disengage immediately. The mission was not to win glory. It was to inflict maximum damage on an asset the Germans believed invulnerable. Abrams asked the question that mattered most. What if the depot does not exist? What if the resistance report was wrong? Patton's answer was characteristic. Then we will have wasted one night and learned that our enemies are even weaker than we hoped. But if it does exist, and we do nothing, those tanks will be killing our soldiers within days. I would rather strike and miss than sit and wait. Abrams accepted the mission without hesitation. He selected his men carefully, prioritizing veterans who had navigated night operations before and who understood the importance of silence. Each tank crew was briefed separately, told only what they needed to know. The armored infantry, drawn from the 4th Armored Division's reconnaissance elements, were specialists in moving quietly through hostile terrain. The engineers brought demolition charges, thermite grenades, and enough explosives to collapse a hillside if necessary. The task force assembled on the night of December 15th in a staging area concealed within a pine forest south of the border. No lights. No fires. Radio silence absolute. The men checked their weapons and equipment with the calm efficiency of soldiers who had done this too many times to feel nervous. They understood the odds. They understood the stakes. And they understood that if anything went wrong, no one was coming to save them. Patton visited them briefly before they departed. He walked among the Shermans, speaking quietly to tank commanders, shaking hands with infantry sergeants. He did not deliver a speech. He did not invoke destiny or history. He simply told them that what they were about to do might end the German offensive before it truly began. He told them that somewhere out there, hidden in the dark, was the fuel feeding the enemy's last hope. And he told them that he trusted them to find it and burn it to ash. At 2200 hours, the column began moving north. Abrams led from the front in his command Sherman, a tank he had named Thunderbolt. The vehicles moved without headlights, navigating by moonlight and the faint glow of instrument panels. The route had been planned to avoid known German positions, threading through gaps in the line identified by reconnaissance patrols. The gamble was that in the chaos of the opening offensive, German rear areas would be thinly guarded, with most reserves committed forward. For the first hour, the advance went smoothly. The column crossed into Luxembourg without incident, bypassing a German supply convoy by simply pulling off the road and letting it pass. The enemy soldiers, exhausted and focused on reaching the front, never noticed the American tanks sitting motionless in the shadows. Once the convoy disappeared, Abrams resumed the march. By midnight, the task force had penetrated 15 miles behind German lines. The landscape grew more rugged, the roads narrower. Twice, they encountered German military police checkpoints. In both cases, Abrams ordered his lead vehicles to approach slowly, as if they were German tanks returning from a mission. The ruse worked. The military police, seeing tracked vehicles in the darkness and hearing engine noise, waved them through without challenge. By the time they realized their mistake, the American. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Column was gone, vanishing into the forest before alarms could be raised. The suspected depot location lay in a valley formed by a bend in the Prum River. According to the resistance report, the Germans had excavated caves into the limestone hillside and connected them with railway spurs. The caves provided natural protection from aerial bombing, and their narrow entrances made ground assault nearly impossible. If the report was accurate, this was a fortress, designed to withstand anything the Allies could throw at it. Abrams halted the column 2 miles short of the target and deployed scouts on foot. These men, moving silently through the undergrowth, reached the valley rim and confirmed what the resistance had reported. Below them, hidden beneath camouflage nets and pine boughs, sat row upon row of armored vehicles. Tigers. Panthers. Panzer IVs. Even a handful of the new Panthers, tank destroyers mounting guns powerful enough to obliterate any Allied tank at extreme range. The depot was real. And it was enormous. The scouts counted at least 80 vehicles, possibly more concealed deeper in the caves. Fuel trucks sat nearby, along with ammunition carriers and repair equipment. A small garrison, perhaps 200 soldiers, provided security, but most of them appeared to be mechanics and logistical personnel rather than combat troops. The defenses were minimal. The Germans had relied on secrecy rather than fortification. Abrams studied the scout reports and made his decision. A direct assault would alert the garrison and give them time to move the tanks or mount a defense. Instead, he would divide his force. One element would remain on the high ground with orders to provide covering fire if the operation went wrong. The second element, including the engineers, would descend into the valley under cover of darkness, plant demolition charges on the fuel trucks and ammunition stores, and set thermite grenades on as many tanks as possible. The goal was not to fight. It was to ignite a catastrophic chain reaction. The engineers moved first, slipping down the hillside with their explosives carefully distributed among them. They reached the valley floor without being detected and began their work with practiced efficiency. Thermite grenades were placed on engine decks, in ammunition racks, and along fuel lines. The charges were timed to detonate simultaneously, ensuring maximum destruction and minimum warning. While the engineers worked, the armored infantry established a perimeter, ready to suppress any response from the German garrison. For 20 minutes, the operation proceeded in near silence. Then a German sentry, making his rounds, stumbled upon an American soldier crouched beside a Panther tank. The sentry shouted an alarm and raised his rifle. The American shot him before he could fire, but the damage was done. Across the depot, lights flared. Voices shouted orders. The garrison was awakening. Abrams did not hesitate. He radioed the engineers with a single word. Now. The demolition charges detonated in a rolling wave of fire and concussion. Fuel trucks exploded, sending sheets of flame across the depot. Thermite grenades burned white-hot, melting through armor plate and igniting ammunition stored inside the tanks. Within seconds, the valley transformed into an inferno. Secondary explosions ripped through the night as tank after tank cooked off, their turrets blown skyward by the force of detonating shells. The German garrison, stunned and blinded by the flames, fired wildly into the darkness. A few soldiers attempted to organize a counterattack, but the American infantry cut them down with disciplined volleys. Abrams brought his Shermans forward, adding their guns to the chaos, targeting any vehicle that had not yet been destroyed. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted less than 15 minutes. By the time the engineers signaled mission complete, the depot had ceased to exist. Abrams ordered an immediate withdrawal. The column reformed and began racing south, retracing the route they had taken into enemy territory. Behind them, the sky glowed orange. Ammunition continued to explode, sending tracers arcing through the darkness. German units in the surrounding area, alerted by the destruction, attempted to intercept the American force, but Abrams moved too quickly. His tanks smashed through roadblocks, bypassed ambushes, and reached Allied lines just before dawn on December 16th, the same morning the German offensive began. The task force had lost 3 Shermans and 11 men. In exchange, they had destroyed or rendered unusable more than 70 German armored vehicles, along with enough fuel and ammunition to supply an entire panzer division for weeks. The Germans, unaware that their reserve had been annihilated, launched their offensive expecting to commit fresh tanks within days. Those tanks never arrived. The units spearheading the attack, already stretched thin, found themselves without reinforcements. Their momentum, so terrifying in the opening hours, began to falter. Patton never publicly acknowledged the raid. Official Third Army records make no mention of it. Abrams, when asked in later years, would only say that he had conducted reconnaissance in force and that the results were satisfactory. The true scale of the operation remained hidden, buried in classified files and the memories of men who understood the value of silence. Yet the impact was undeniable. Historians examining the Battle of the Bulge have long puzzled over why the German offensive stalled so quickly despite its initial success. Fuel shortages are often cited, along with unexpectedly fierce American resistance. But fuel shortages do not explain why promised reserves never materialized. They do not explain why German armored units, expecting reinforcements, instead found themselves isolated and vulnerable. The hidden strike had severed the artery feeding Germany's last great gamble. Without the depot, without those tanks, the offensive became a race the Germans could not win. They advanced. They threatened. But they could not sustain. And in winter warfare, an army that cannot sustain is an army already defeated. Patton's decision to authorize the raid, without orders and without official sanction, was a calculated risk that bordered on insubordination. Had it failed, his career would have ended in disgrace. Had it succeeded but become public knowledge, he might have faced court-martial for exceeding his authority. But it did succeed. And it remained secret. And because of that, the tide turned not in a single dramatic battle but in the shadows, where a handful of men destroyed what the enemy believed untouchable. The story of that night, of Abrams and his task force descending into a hidden valley and setting fire to Germany's hope, is not found in most histories of the war. It exists in fragments, in coded dispatches, in the journals of soldiers who were there and who carried the truth quietly until they could no longer speak. It is a reminder that wars are decided not only by grand strategies and massed armies but by moments of audacity, by decisions made in darkness, by commanders willing to gamble everything on a single throw of the dice. And it is a reminder that George Patton, for all his flaws and fury, understood something fundamental about warfare. Victory does not wait for permission. It does not announce itself with trumpets. It comes to those who see the chance, seize it, and strike before the enemy knows what has happened. On the night of December 15, 1944, in a valley no one remembers, that truth burned bright enough to light the sky. The dawn of December 16 revealed chaos across the Ardennes front, but within that chaos lay patterns that Allied intelligence officers struggled to comprehend. German units were advancing with ferocity, yet their progress seemed strangely uneven. Some divisions drove deep into American positions, while others stalled after minimal gains. Fuel shortages were reported almost immediately, far sooner than German planners should have allowed. Ammunition expenditure outpaced resupply in ways that suggested desperation rather than confidence. Something had gone wrong with the German plan before the offensive even began, though no one on the Allied side understood why. At Supreme Headquarters, analysts pored over intercepts and reconnaissance photos, searching for explanations. They noted that several panzer divisions were operating at half strength, their tank companies reporting readiness levels far below what intelligence had predicted. Radio traffic indicated confusion among German logistics officers, urgent requests for fuel and replacement vehicles that headquarters seemed unable to fulfill. The Wehrmacht had launched its offensive with impressive strength, but that strength was not being sustained. The reserves everyone feared were not materializing. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, met with his staff on December 18 to assess the situation. The German penetration had created a bulge in Allied lines that threatened to widen into a catastrophic breakthrough, yet Bradley sensed an opportunity emerging from the crisis. The Germans were overextended. Their supply lines stretched dangerously thin. If the Allies could hold at critical points and counterattack with fresh forces, the entire German offensive might collapse into a trap. The question was whether American units could withstand the pressure long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Patton's Third Army completed its pivot northward in a feat of logistics that astounded even skeptical observers. Entire divisions changed direction in winter conditions, marched through ice storms, and arrived at Bastogne ready to fight. The speed of the movement defied conventional military wisdom. Staff officers at other headquarters assumed Patton had received advance warning, that somehow he had known the German offensive was coming and prepared accordingly. They were not entirely wrong. Patton had prepared, but not because of prophetic intelligence. He had prepared because he understood that wars are won by those willing to act on incomplete information, to commit resources before certainty arrives. What none of these officers knew, what remained hidden even from Bradley and Eisenhower, was that Patton had already struck the decisive blow. The raid on the hidden depot had been executed with such secrecy that its success remained invisible to everyone except those who participated. Abrams and his men returned to their units and resumed normal operations as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The destroyed tanks, the burning fuel dumps, the obliterated ammunition stores existed only in German reports, and those reports were not being shared with the Allies. The Wehrmacht's high command knew they had lost a critical reserve, but they could not admit the scale of the disaster without revealing their own catastrophic security failure. German field commanders, unaware of the depot's destruction, continued to plan as if reinforcements would arrive. Panzer divisions that had broken through American lines held their positions, waiting for the promised second wave that would exploit their gains. Staff officers assured frontline units that fresh Tigers and Panthers were en route, that fuel convoys were moving forward, that the offensive would regain momentum within days. These assurances were based on plans drawn up weeks earlier, plans that assumed a reserve that no longer existed. The gap between expectation and reality grew wider with each passing day, and as it grew, the German offensive began to starve. On December 19, elements of the 2nd Panzer Division reached Celles, less than 5 miles from the Meuse River. They were the deepest German penetration of the entire offensive, a spearhead that should have been reinforced and pushed forward to seize the bridges. Instead, the division found itself isolated. No fuel arrived. No replacement tanks appeared. American forces surrounded the position and methodically destroyed it. The 2nd Panzer, once an elite formation, ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Survivors who were captured spoke of confusion and betrayal, of promises made by officers who seemed genuinely bewildered that help had not come. Similar scenes unfolded across the Bulge. German units that had achieved tactical victories found themselves unable to exploit them. They sat in captured villages, surrounded by knocked-out American vehicles, waiting for orders that made no sense. Pull back. Consolidate. Conserve fuel. These were not the commands of an army on the offensive. They were the vocabulary of defeat, spoken by commanders who were beginning to understand that something fundamental had gone wrong. The defense of Bastogne became the symbol of American resistance, the story that would dominate popular memory of the battle. Surrounded troops holding against impossible odds, refusing to surrender, buying time for relief forces to arrive. It was true, and it was heroic, but it was also incomplete. Bastogne held not only because of the courage of its defenders but because the Germans lacked the resources to crush it. They besieged the town with infantry and artillery, but the massed tank assaults that should have overwhelmed the perimeter never came. German commanders allocated their remaining armor carefully, husbanding strength that could not be replaced, and in doing so they allowed the Americans to stabilize a defense that should have crumbled. Patton's forces reached Bastogne on December 26, breaking the siege and shifting the momentum permanently. The relief column, led by Abrams and his 4th Armored Division, punched through German lines with an aggression that stunned defenders. The same tanks that had burned the depot 10 days earlier now carved a corridor to the surrounded town, and the Germans could not stop them. They tried. They threw blocking forces into the path. They called down artillery. But they could not mask the armored counterattack that might have sealed the corridor shut. The tanks they needed were ash and twisted metal in a valley far behind the lines. By early January, the German offensive had collapsed entirely. Allied forces drove the Wehrmacht back to its starting positions and beyond, recapturing ground and inflicting losses the Germans could not afford. The Bulge flattened. The threat evaporated. And the Wehrmacht, having expended its last reserves in a gamble that failed, retreated into Germany with the certainty that no more offensives were possible. They would fight defensively from this point forward, trading space for time, hoping for a miracle that would never arrive. In the aftermath of the battle, casualty reports and damage assessments filtered through military bureaucracies. The Americans had lost heavily, nearly 20,000 killed and tens of thousands more wounded or captured. Equipment losses were staggering. Entire battalions had been overrun in the opening days. Yet the Germans had lost more, particularly in irreplaceable assets. Experienced tank crews, veteran infantry, officers who understood combined arms warfare, all gone. The Luftwaffe, making a rare appearance to support the offensive, had been massacred by Allied fighters. And the tanks, always the tanks, had been consumed at a rate that German industry could not hope to match. Analysts attempting to understand why the German offensive failed so completely focused on familiar explanations. Allied air superiority once the weather cleared. American resilience and fighting spirit. German logistical incompetence. Fuel shortages exacerbated by partisan attacks on supply lines. All of these factors were real and significant. But they did not fully explain why German reserves had failed to appear, why promised reinforcements never materialized, why the offensive lost steam so quickly after such a promising start. A few intelligence officers noticed anomalies in captured German documents. References to a depot that should have been supplying frontline units. Urgent queries about the status of armored reserves that were supposed to be ready for deployment. Angry exchanges between field commanders and rear area logistics staff, accusations of incompetence and sabotage. These fragments suggested that something had disrupted German planning at a fundamental level, but the specifics remained unclear. The documents were filed away, noted as evidence of internal German dysfunction, and forgotten. Patton never spoke publicly about the raid. He deflected questions about how Third Army had moved so quickly, attributing it to superior training and aggressive leadership. When asked about his confidence during the crisis, he offered his usual bravado, claiming he had always known the Germans were beaten and that the Ardennes was their death spasm. Privately, in conversations with officers he trusted, he allowed himself small moments of satisfaction. He had seen the opportunity. He had taken the risk. And it had worked. The depot's destruction had crippled the offensive before most people knew it existed. Abrams, promoted and given larger commands as the war progressed into Germany, maintained absolute silence about the mission. His men, scattered across various units as the army reorganized, understood that what they had done was not to be discussed. Some kept journals or wrote letters home that hinted at a significant action in mid-December, but these accounts were vague and contradictory. No coherent narrative emerged. The operation remained fragmented, existing in pieces that could not be assembled into a complete picture without access to information that was classified and would remain so for decades. The French resistance cell that had provided the initial intelligence never learned whether their report had been acted upon. They continued their work, passing information to Allied handlers, disrupting German movements, and waiting for liberation. When American forces finally reached their region in early 1945, the resistance fighters asked about the depot near Bitburg, whether the Allies had bombed it or if the Germans had evacuated it. The American officers they spoke with had no knowledge of any such target. The resistance assumed their report had been ignored, another piece of intelligence lost in the chaos of war. German survivors of the depot's destruction were scattered and silenced. The Wehrmacht's high command, desperate to avoid blame for the offensive's failure, buried evidence of the catastrophe. Officers who might have testified to what happened were reassigned or killed in the final months of the war. Records were destroyed as Allied armies closed in on Berlin. The few written accounts that survived were fragmentary, describing an American raid of unusual precision but providing no context or analysis. Post-war interrogations of German generals focused on strategic decisions and grand campaigns, not on obscure logistical disasters. The depot became a footnote, if it was mentioned at all. As the war in Europe ground toward its conclusion, the significance of individual actions blurred into the larger narrative of overwhelming Allied superiority. The Soviets drove from the east, the Western Allies from the west, and Germany crumbled between them. Historians would later debate the necessity of various operations, the wisdom of different strategies, the competence of commanders. The Battle of the Bulge would be analyzed exhaustively, its lessons dissected from military academies and strategic theorists. But the hidden strike, the night raid that shattered Germany's reserve, remained invisible. It had succeeded so completely that its success could not be separated from the background noise of German collapse. Patton died in December 1945, 6 months after victory in Europe, from injuries sustained in a traffic accident. His legacy was already secure, the image of the aggressive armored commander who terrified enemies and exasperated superiors. Biographers would chronicle his campaigns, his controversies, his complex personality. They would debate his effectiveness, his judgment, his place among the great captains of history. But they would not write about the night of December 15, 1944, because the documentation did not exist. The orders were never written. The reports were never filed. The truth remained with the men who had been there, and they carried it silently. Abrams rose to the highest ranks of the American military, eventually commanding forces in Vietnam and later serving as Army Chief of Staff. His reputation was built on competence, courage, and an understanding of armored warfare that few could match. Journalists and historians who interviewed him about World War II heard stories of Bastogne, of the drive across France, of the final push into Germany. When asked if there were operations that remained classified or forgotten, he would smile slightly and say that every war contains moments that are not recorded, actions taken in darkness that achieve their purpose precisely because they remain unknown. He never elaborated. The soldiers who participated in the raid returned to civilian life carrying memories they could not share. Some tried to write about it, producing manuscripts that were confiscated by military censors or simply rejected by publishers who found the accounts too fantastical to believe. How could a single battalion penetrate 20 miles behind enemy lines, destroy a major German installation, and return without significant losses? It sounded like fiction, like the exaggerated war stories told in bars by men seeking attention. The veterans stopped trying to convince anyone. They gathered occasionally at reunions, spoke carefully about that night, and took comfort in shared knowledge that the outside world would never understand. Decades passed. The generation that fought the war aged and diminished. Archives were declassified in waves, revealing secrets that had been protected for years. Scholars gained access to German records, Soviet files, intelligence reports that filled gaps in the historical narrative. Slowly, pieces of the hidden strike began to surface. A notation in a Third Army logistics report mentioning an unauthorized fuel expenditure on December 15. A French resistance message forwarded to multiple intelligence agencies. A cryptic entry in Abrams' personnel file noting special operations experience. German documents describing the loss of a supply depot under circumstances that remained unclear. In the 1980s, a military historian researching armored operations in the Battle of the Bulge noticed these fragments and began connecting them. He interviewed aging veterans, some of whom were finally willing to discuss what they had seen. He cross-referenced German and American records, looking for patterns that might explain the anomalies. What emerged was not a complete story, the documentation was too sparse for that, but an outline of something extraordinary. A raid that had been hidden not just from the public but from official military history. An operation that had achieved strategic impact without acknowledgement or recognition. The historian published his findings in a specialized journal, expecting little reaction. Instead, the article sparked controversy. Some scholars dismissed it as speculation based on insufficient evidence. Others found it compelling, arguing that it explained inconsistencies in the battle's narrative that had never been satisfactorily resolved. Veterans who had remained silent for 40 years began to speak more openly, providing details that corroborated the basic outline. The debate attracted mainstream attention, and suddenly the hidden strike was no longer hidden. Documentaries were produced. Books were written. The story entered popular consciousness as a forgotten chapter of World War II, an example of how individual audacity could shift the course of massive campaigns. Patton's reputation, already legendary, gained a new dimension. He had not merely been a bold commander who spoke his mind and drove his troops hard. He had been willing to defy orders, to authorize operations that could have ended his career, to gamble on intelligence that others dismissed. The raid on the depot became evidence of strategic vision, proof that he understood warfare at a level his contemporaries did not fully appreciate. Yet even as the story gained recognition, questions remained. How much impact had the raid actually had? Would the German offensive have failed anyway, ground down by the factors historians had already identified? Was it possible to attribute strategic outcomes to a single tactical action, or was that simply the human desire to find simple explanations for complex events? Military analysts debated these questions without reaching consensus. Some argued that the destruction of the depot was decisive, that without those reserves the German offensive was doomed from the start. Others maintained that while the raid was impressive, it was merely one factor among many, and that Germany's defeat in the Ardennes was inevitable regardless. What could not be debated was the courage of the men who executed the mission. Whatever its ultimate impact, the raid required extraordinary skill and nerve. Moving through enemy territory in darkness, navigating without lights, maintaining silence while knowing that discovery meant annihilation, these were not the actions of ordinary soldiers. The men who followed Abrams into that valley understood the risks and accepted them. They placed explosives on tanks while German sentries walked nearby. They held their fire when every instinct screamed to shoot. They trusted their training, their leaders, and each other. And when the moment came to act, they did so with precision that professionals could only admire. The legacy of the hidden strike extends beyond military history into broader questions about how wars are fought and remembered. It challenges the notion that history is written by the victors, revealing instead that history is written by those who document their actions. Patton and Abrams won a significant victory, but because they chose not to document it, because they prioritized operational security over recognition, the victory nearly disappeared. Historians studying warfare must always wonder what other actions have been lost, what other decisive moments occurred in shadows too deep for records to penetrate. The story also illuminates the nature of leadership and the burden of command. Patton made a decision that could have destroyed him professionally. He authorized an operation without approval, committed resources without oversight, and accepted full responsibility for whatever outcome resulted. Had the raid failed catastrophically, had Abrams and his men been captured or killed, the political consequences would have been severe. Patton would have faced charges of gross negligence at minimum, possibly court-martial. His career, his reputation, everything he had built would have ended in disgrace. He knew this. And he gave the order anyway. This willingness to accept risk, to make decisions based on incomplete information and bear the consequences, separates great commanders from competent ones. Many officers could have seen the potential in the resistance report. Most would have forwarded it up the chain of command, seeking approval, covering themselves against failure. Patton saw it and acted, trusting his judgment over institutional caution. The raid succeeded not because it was safe or approved but because Patton understood that in war, opportunities vanish faster than committees can evaluate them. Abrams demonstrated a complementary form of leadership. Given an impossible mission, he did not protest or seek clarification. He understood what Patton needed, accepted the responsibility, and executed flawlessly. His planning was meticulous. His selection of personnel was precise. His tactical decisions during the raid showed flexibility and composure under pressure. When the alarm was raised and the operation threatened to unravel, he did not panic or abort. He adapted, completed the mission, and extracted his force with minimal losses. This combination of careful preparation and improvised response is the hallmark of excellence in military operations. The French resistance fighters who provided the initial intelligence demonstrated their own form of courage, operating behind enemy lines with the constant threat of capture and execution. They observed German activity, transmitted their findings to Allied contacts, and continued their work without knowing whether anyone was listening. Their contribution made the raid possible, yet they received no recognition because the operation they enabled was never officially acknowledged. This is the nature of intelligence work in wartime, gathering information that might change everything or might disappear into bureaucratic indifference, never knowing which outcome will occur. For the German soldiers guarding the depot, the night became a nightmare that destroyed their confidence in their own security. They had believed the location was secret, the tanks safe, the war proceeding according to plan. Then fire erupted from darkness, explosions tore through carefully maintained vehicles, and American troops appeared where no Americans should have been. The psychological impact of such an attack, the realization that nowhere was truly safe, rippled through German forces in ways that cannot be quantified but were nonetheless real. Soldiers who feel secure fight differently than soldiers who know the enemy can strike anywhere at any time. The destruction of the depot also revealed the fragility of modern military logistics. Armies in World War II consumed supplies at staggering rates. Tanks required fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and maintenance facilities. Infantry needed food, water, weapons, and medical support. Artillery fired shells by the thousands. All of this material had to be transported, stored, and distributed under conditions that ranged from difficult to impossible. A single catastrophic loss, one depot destroyed, could cascade through the entire supply chain, affecting operations far from the point of impact. The Germans discovered this truth in the Ardennes, watching their offensive collapse not because their soldiers lacked courage or their tactics failed but because the material foundation of the campaign had been shattered before it began. Comparing the hidden strike to other special operations in World War II reveals both similarities and unique aspects. The raid shares characteristics with commando missions conducted by British and American forces throughout the war, small units penetrating enemy territory to accomplish specific objectives. But most such operations were conducted with explicit approval from high command, supported by detailed intelligence, and acknowledged afterward regardless of outcome. The hidden strike was different. It was conceived and executed in secrecy that persisted beyond the war's end. It succeeded strategically while remaining tactically invisible. This raises questions about how many other operations might have occurred under similar circumstances. Did other commanders authorize missions that were never recorded? Are there decisive actions buried in archives that historians have not yet connected? The nature of classified operations means that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. What we know about World War II is constrained by what was documented and what has been declassified. The hidden strike suggests that significant gaps remain, that the history we teach and learn is incomplete in ways we cannot fully measure. The philosophical implications are equally intriguing. If an action changes history but remains unknown, does it still matter? The raid on the depot affected the course of the Battle of the Bulge whether or not anyone knew about it. German tanks that should have reinforced the offensive instead burned in a valley, and that physical reality shaped events regardless of documentation. Yet the raid's absence from the historical record meant that subsequent interpretations of the battle were based on incomplete information. Strategies were analyzed, lessons were drawn, doctrine was written, all without accounting for a factor that may have been decisive. This suggests that our understanding of history is always provisional, always subject to revision as new information emerges. For students of military strategy, the hidden strike offers lessons that extend beyond World War II. The importance of intelligence gathering and the courage to act on uncertain information. The value of small, precisely targeted operations compared to large, conventional engagements. The reality that logistics and supply are as important as firepower and maneuver. The understanding that wars are won by accumulation of small advantages that compound over time. These principles apply across conflicts and eras, shaping how modern militaries plan and execute operations. The human dimension of the story resonates most powerfully. Men who were asked to do the impossible and did it. Leaders who made decisions knowing they might be destroyed by the consequences. Soldiers who fought in darkness, uncertain of outcomes, trusting in each other and their training. Veterans who carried secrets for decades, unable to share the most significant experiences of their lives. Historians who pieced together fragments, driven by curiosity and respect for those who served. All of these people contributed to a narrative that was nearly lost, a story that reminds us that history is not merely what happened but what we remember and why. The depot burned for 3 days. German fire brigades attempted to contain the flames, but secondary explosions kept reigniting the inferno. Smoke rose high enough to be visible from American positions miles away. Pilots flying reconnaissance missions reported a massive fire in the area but could not determine its source or significance. The Germans cordoned off the valley, preventing civilians and unauthorized personnel from approaching. When the fires finally died, cleanup crews found wreckage so complete that salvage was impossible. Steel had melted. Ammunition had cooked off. Fuel had burned away entirely. What remained was twisted metal and ash. In Berlin, officials received reports of the disaster with disbelief that turned to fury. Investigations were launched to determine how security had failed so catastrophically. Scapegoats were found and punished. New procedures were implemented to prevent similar losses. But none of it mattered. The tanks were gone. The fuel was gone. The offensive that had been planned with such care now lacked the reserves it needed to succeed. Field commanders were told to make do with what they had, to achieve victory through skill and determination rather than material superiority. It was a formula for failure, and they knew it. The American soldiers who executed the raid returned to their units and continued fighting as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. They advanced through the Ardennes, crossed into Germany, participated in the final campaigns that crushed the Third Reich. Some died in subsequent battles. Some survived and went home. All of them carried the knowledge that they had struck a blow that mattered, even if the world never learned of it. In quiet moments, in the years that followed, they wondered what would have happened if the raid had failed, if the German reserves had reached the front, if the offensive had broken through to the Meuse. They knew they could not answer such questions with certainty. But they also knew what they had done, and that was enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.